Today we're out here in rainy San Antonio, Texas, taking a look at the all-new 2017 Jeep Compass. Now the Compass you could also think of as a 2018 model because the 2017 model year will apparently be fairly short, followed by a pretty normal length 2018 model year. This vehicle replaces both the current Jeep Compass and the Jeep Patriot. Like the outgoing Compass, the new Compass is the Grand Cherokee's mini-me in terms of overall styling. So we have a 7-slot grille and headlamps that look very much like top-end trims of the Grand Cherokee. The red model that I'm standing right next to is the top-end limited trim, so we get a little bit more chrome around the front. We get these projector beam headlamps and fog lamps right down below. Now, the blue model right over here is the off-road Trailhawk model, so we have tow hooks right here, and you'll notice the bumper is quite different. At this angle, you'll notice the bumper sort of slopes inwards at the bottom. That's in order to give that vehicle a better approach angle. In addition to the altered front bumper and the red tow hooks, we get a slightly different Jeep grille right up top. An interesting bit of trivia is that this 7-slot grille is actually not an air intake at all because it's completely sealed. All of the cooling goes on in these zones right down here, lower on the front. The reason the grille is essentially closed off and the reason that we get this lower front bumper over here on the other models of the Compass is for aerodynamic efficiency. At 173 inches long, the Compass slots somewhere between the average subcompact crossover and the average compact crossover in terms of overall length. That means that competition is a little tricky to define with the Compass because this is about 7 inches longer than the Jeep Renegade, but 9 inches shorter than the Jeep Cherokee. This is possible because the Renegade is one of the shorter subcompact vehicles in its category, and the Cherokee is one of the longer vehicles. So this is about 4 inches longer than something like a Honda HR-V, 6 inches longer than a Chevy Trax, but only about 3 inches shorter than something like a Hyundai Tucson, which is one of the smaller compact vehicles in the US. That means that competition for the Compass could be seen as the Honda HR-V or the Hyundai Tucson or a Kia Sportage or something like the Chevy Trax. The other way to look at the Compass, of course, is as a vehicle that doesn't really have any direct competition because the Chevy Trax is about the same size as the Renegade, the Chevy Equinox is about the same size as the Cherokee, and there's no Chevy model that's about the same size as the Compass. Ground clearance varies based on the model that you get. The all-wheel drive limited model right over there, the red one, gives us 8.2 inches of ground clearance. If you get the Trailhawk, like this blue model right here, that jumps up to 8.5. Interestingly enough, if you were to order your Compass in Brazil, then you actually get an additional ride height increase. The Trailhawk edition of the Compass gets that additional ride height increase. We also get the unique front end that we see over there in that blue model, the tow hooks on the front and the rear, a full-size spare tire, and they adjust the final drive ratio in the transmission to give it a 20-to-1 ratio for crawling. The model that we're taking a look over here in the red is an all-wheel drive limited model. The lowest ratio in this one is 17.6. You also get hill descent control and an electronic rock crawling mode, as well as an electronic limited slip system. That's sort of like traction control on steroids. It attempts to direct power from wheel to wheel rather than reducing engine power. In addition to that, we also get skid plates for more serious off-roading duty. Like the Renegade Trailhawk and the Cherokee Trailhawk, that makes the Compass Trailhawk easily the most capable vehicle in its segment. Of course, if you want to do any real off-roading, you're probably going to want a Wrangler. As with the front end, the back end pays homage to the Grand Cherokee. Now, these are not really the same shapes as we find on the larger Jeep, but they are very, very similar. This particular Compass is the Trailhawk trim, so we have that tow hook right over there on the driver's side. We also have a tow hitch receiver because this is actually rated for towing 2,000 pounds. That's kind of unusual in this particular segment. There aren't really very many compact or subcompact vehicles rated to tow, and this is one of them. Of course, if you need to tow more, the Cherokee will tow around 4,500 pounds. If you opt for the limited trim, then we get a slightly tweaked bumper and dual exhaust tips on the passenger side. In the United States, we find just one engine under the hood. It is this 2.4-liter four-cylinder engine that we see in a few other Jeep products. It produces 180 horsepower and 175 pound-feet of torque. Now, in other world markets, you will see a few different engines, but for us, this is the one we're getting at the moment. The Compass starts out with a 6-speed manual transmission and front-wheel drive. You can also get a 6-speed automatic and front-wheel drive, a 6-speed manual and all-wheel drive, or a 9-speed automatic and all-wheel drive. Depending on which transmission you get and whether you select front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, your fuel economy will vary between 25 miles per gallon and 26 miles per gallon on the new 2017 cycle. That's quite good for this segment. Front seat comfort is very good for this segment. We have a seat bottom cushion that's a little bit longer than the average in this segment, makes it a little bit more comfortable for taller drivers. We also have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support available in most trims and standard in the top-end trims. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion and 4-way adjustable headrests. As we see in many vehicles in this segment, the front passenger seat is a manual seat. It's not a power seat, and we don't get the adjustable lumbar support. As you would expect from a vehicle that straddles segments, we find more legroom back here than your average subcompact crossover. Sitting right here behind myself, I have about 4 or 5 inches of room left. However, we find less room back here than some of the larger compact crossovers. Sitting very upright in the back, my head does touch the ceiling, but our model is equipped with this large panoramic sunroof. If I move over to the middle seat, my headroom is about the same as the outboard seating positions because of the way the roof is shaped. If I move all the way over to the right side, where this front seat was all the way back in its tracks, I still have about 2 inches of legroom left. This is notably more than you'll find in something like a Mazda CX-3 or a Chevy Trax. In addition, the rear bench seat is wider than the average subcompact crossover, so we find more room across the back for car seats than something like the Trax or the Buick Encore or the Honda HR-V. The extra width is perhaps most noticeable right here in the rear bench seat because we have a center armrest with 2 large cup holders, and it's a decent amount wider than the average subcompact. We still have a 60/40 folding rear bench seat, and a nice touch is the center seatbelt comes out of the seat back itself, not out of the ceiling. Behind the rear hatch, we find 27.2 cubic feet of storage space. That's quite impressive because that's not only larger than the Jeep Renegade, it's actually more room than you find in the Jeep Cherokee. This is about 4 cubic feet more than you'll find in a Honda HR-V, and it's quite similar to what you find in a Kia Sportage or the Hyundai Tucson. Under the cargo area load floor, we find a spare tire, and in the Trailhawk model, it's a full-size spare. Now, we're in the Limited, so we actually get the option of putting this load floor a little bit closer to the ground than its most upright position, but you wouldn't be able to do that if you did have the full-size spare tire in your Trailhawk model. Another area where this is different than subcompact crossovers is that we have a power tailgate hatch available in the top-end trims. Because of the generous size of this rear cargo area and the optional power hatch, I'm going to give this cargo area 10 out of 10 points in our exclusive Trunk Comfort Index. We're taking a quick spin around the Limited interior, so we do again have this large panoramic moonroof, height adjustable seatbelts for both the driver and the front passenger, and those 4-way adjustable headrests. The model that we're in sports this 2-tone leather upholstery. The seats are perforated, but they're not ventilated. The majority of the front door panels are made from soft touch plastics, and the overall design theme is very similar to the Jeep Cherokee and the Jeep Grand Cherokee. This is a little bit different than something like the Renegade. The design features a very similar shape to this infotainment cluster where we find a 5-inch, a 7-inch, or an 8.4-inch Uconnect screen. This is the latest software version of Uconnect that we also see in the brand new Chrysler Pacifica. In addition to the redesigned user interface, this also supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Continuing down the dashboard, we find the controls for the optional dual-zone climate control system, the controls for the all-wheel drive system. We have a 4-wheel drive lock mode, auto, snow, sand, and mud. Now, if we were in the Trailhawk, we would get some additional controls for the rock control mode. We also have a USB input, an auxiliary input, and a 12-volt power outlet. The Gearshift design is similar to one used in other Jeep models. We pull all the way down for drive, over to the left for the manual mode. We pull towards the driver for up, and push away from the driver for down. Between the front seats, we find 2 large cup holders, the control for the electric parking brake, traction control, and the auto start-stop system. Then we have a small center armrest that is padded and opens to reveal a moderately sized storage cubby. Because we're in the top end trim, we have a 7-inch LCD right here between the speedometer and the tachometer. It gives you some additional gauges, as well as your trip computer information and navigation directions. Zooming out from there, we find the same steering wheel we find in a variety of other Jeep models, including the Grand Cherokee. On the right side, we find the controls for the cruise control system. On the left side, we find phone hang-up and pickup, and the controls for that multifunction display. You'll find the controls for the audio system on the back of the steering wheel. We have track up and down on the left side, and then volume up and down on the right. With the same engine under the hood, but a little bit more weight than the Jeep Renegade, I expect acceleration times to come in right around 9.5 seconds. That does put this slower than some of the compact crossovers out there that have more power under the hood especially. If you want a fast 0 to 60 time, the Jeep Cherokee with the V6 will certainly be faster than this. Most of the entries in the segment above this are going to be faster 0 to 60, so something like a Hyundai Tucson or definitely the turbocharged Sportage, turbocharged versions of the Ford Escape, they're going to be faster 0 to 60 than the Compass. However, this is not necessarily any slower than the average entry in the subcompact category. The Mazda CX-3, the Honda HR-V, and the Chevy Trax are not exactly swift entries. In our preliminary braking test, this limited model with the widest tire available stopped from 60 miles an hour to 0 in 115 feet, which was surprisingly short. 235 with tires are very wide for a vehicle in this particular segment, and it really does help the braking score in the Compass as well as the handling score. The previous generation of the Compass and the Patriot weren't exactly corner carvers, but this limited trim finally is. Of course, the handling score will vary depending on the model that you get. Base Compass models come with 215 with tires, although they're not that much lighter than the four-wheel drive limited model that we're driving right here, so they will definitely handle worse than what we're driving. The Trailhawk model actually gets slightly skinnier tires than this limited trim does, and they're off-road focused, so on-road manners will take a little bit of a hit. Thanks to the wide tires on this limited trim and the available all-wheel drive system that seems to be much more aggressive at sending power to the rear than most of the competitors out there, this is almost as much fun as certain versions of the Ford Escape, and that's pretty high praise in this segment. As I frequently say, ride and handling are two ends of the teeter-totter, and the higher ride height that we find in the Compass actually helps us out when it comes to the ride quality, because the suspension has more travel to use out here on this winding Texas highway that's definitely very bumpy. It was also very noticeable when I had both the limited and the latitude trims out on the highway. The Compass delivers a much more polished ride than the average subcompact crossover, a little bit more similar to the average compact crossover because of the overall weight. This does weigh just about the same as a RAV4. It's notably heavier than something like a Mazda CX-3. Although we aren't on our usual test services, cabin noise did come in at a respectable 71 decibels. That's fairly average for the compact crossover group. It's a little bit difficult to comment on fuel economy, but we have been averaging between 22 and 26 miles per gallon over a day, and about 250 miles of mixed driving in a variety of different versions of the Compass. You can thank the 9-speed automatic transmission for the high fuel economy, especially the high fuel economy at highway speeds. In fact, 9th gear won't engage in this vehicle until about 80 miles an hour or so, and that really has a positive impact on highway fuel economy, especially if you're traveling at higher speeds. One thing worth noting is that although this is the same 9-speed automatic that we find in the Jeep Cherokee, the software programming in the Compass is probably the best I have experienced so far. Now that said, this transmission is not going to be quite as smooth as some of the 8-speed transmissions out there just because of the design of the transmission. If you want to know more about that, I have a separate video on my channel that goes into great detail about how the ZF 9-speed transmission is designed and exactly why it feels the way that it does at certain times. This is one of the things that you cannot do in your RAV4 or your CR-V or your CX-3, and that's because the Jeep Compass was designed for off-roading. Mild off-roading, albeit, compared to something like a Jeep Wrangler, but definitely serious off-roading compared to any other crossover out there. Not only do we have more wheel articulation than in any of the other vehicles, but we also have a traction stability control system specifically designed for this instance. So I'm going to go ahead and tell him to pull forward. So go ahead and creep forward very slowly. You'll notice that this right rear wheel is actually spinning, and it's spinning at about the same rate as all of the other wheels. This is not your typical traction and stability control system. This is also why we have skid plates standard in the Trailhawk package to help protect the underside of the vehicle as you're doing this, because obviously you can end up with your left rear tire, your right rear tire, or even a front tire impacting the ground pretty hard. Now, of course, more of you are probably going to have your Compass out on snow or on sleet or icy road surfaces than in the middle of a mud pit right like this, but the same sort of principle applies. Because this traction control system allows you to have all the wheels going at around the same speed without cutting engine power, you can actually power your way out of sticky situations like this a little easier than you can in your average crossover. As you'd expect from a vehicle that straddles segments, the price tag of the Compass now straddles segments as well. The Sport starts at $20,995, but that does get you front-wheel drive and a manual transmission. If you want the four-wheel drive system or all-wheel drive system, that will set you back $22,495. Most shoppers are likely going to end up with a Latitude trim, and that starts at $24,295. By the time you add options, you will end up in the high 20s. If you want the Trailhawk model, that is the off-road capable version, that's $28,595. This red limited trim started at $28,995. It has the highest starting price of any of the Compass trims, but it also has the most standard equipment. The model that we've been driving here is a fully loaded all-wheel drive version of the limited trim, and so this is somewhere in the mid-30s. Jeep hasn't really said exactly what this model will cost you. The top-end limited trim is more expensive than many of the subcompact crossovers available in the United States, especially a fully loaded model like this one right here. This is definitely going to set you back more than an HR-V or a CX-3 or a Chevy Trax. In fact, the top-end limited trim can get just about as expensive as many of the compact mainstream crossovers like the RAV4 in top-end trims and the CR-V in top-end trims. But it is still less expensive than top-end trims of the Jeep Cherokee, which is half a step larger. For our complete comparison section, you will of course have to wait until we can get our hands on one for a complete week, but the half-step nature of the Compass really is the important thing to keep in mind, because this is larger than an HR-V, but not quite as large as a CR-V. It's larger than the Renegade, but not quite as large as the Cherokee. And everything else about the Compass fits right in between those two ranges. The pricing, the functionality, the feature set on the inside, etc. We find more luxury features in this interior than we find in Chevy or Honda or Toyota's subcompact crossovers, but not as many as you find in some of those compact crossovers. We also don't find a more powerful engine under the hood like you can get in something like the Kia Sportage with that 2-liter turbo. The bottom line to the average shopper is that in the Jeep portfolio, we find more sizes, more shapes, more trim levels, and more features available or optional than in the competition. So it may be a little bit easier to find a Jeep that fits you a little better. The larger Cherokee has a more capable 4-wheel drive system. It also has that available V6 under the hood and more room across the rear bench seat. The Renegade is less expensive, but bottom end trims of the Renegade also don't have as many features as we find in the sport trim of the Compass. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. This has been the 2017 Jeep Compass. Be sure and stay tuned for our full review on this model coming up very soon. I'll see you next week.